All right, so yes, my name is Ben Ilegbodu. Gant kind of got it, but not really. And I'm here to talk about React Native and ES.Next and how they go well together. So when I'm talking about ES.Next, I'm talking about ES 2015 or ES6 as most people know about it, ES 2016, ES 2017 that's coming out officially later this year, and about how we can apply that while developing React Native applications. So if you're the type of person who likes to take a lot of notes while you see slides, we'll let you know that I tweeted out a link to my slides. If you go to my Twitter account, BenMVP, you should be able to find a link there, or if you can read that long, short URL down there, you can also navigate towards it to be able to have the slides so that you can have that for yourself. So, whenever I give a talk, the first thing I like to do is to get everyone to stand up. So, how do I get everyone to stand up? Everyone to stand up. You know, it's right before lunch. You know, you've been sitting down for like an hour straight. You know, so what we're gonna do is just get the blood flowing, work off some calories before we go and eat. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do 10 squats like this. All right. So you got to put your laptop down, or hold it like, oh, you could hold it like this. Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay. So close it. We're gonna do 10 squats. We'll do it together. I'll count it out together. All right. And if you're not physically able to do this, please do not feel the least self-conscious about it. It's just something fun I want to do just to get us started. All right. So here we go. Ready? 1, 2, yeah. 3, 4, 5, almost there. 6, 7, feel the burn. 8, 9, and 10. Great job, everyone. Wait, before you sit down, turn to somebody next to you, say hello, and introduce yourself. All right. Great. Excellent. Now that you've all met each other, I wanted to introduce myself once formally. Like I said, my name is Ben Ilegbodu. I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father. This is my wife, Rashida. We'll be married 7 years in September. And we have, oh yeah, thank you. We have 2 daughters, Simone and Avery. Simone is there on the right. She's almost 3.5 years old. And Avery on the left is about 10 months old. And we live in a town about an hour outside of San Francisco called Pittsburgh, California, not Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Okay, there's no H at the end. It just ends with the G. And I currently am an engineering manager at Eventbrite. So hopefully you are familiar with Eventbrite because you all bought your tickets on Eventbrite, right? So you should at least be familiar, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to take it to the next level. Everyone buys tickets on Eventbrite because an organizer told them, hey, go buy your tickets on Eventbrite. But what we want to do is we want you to come to Eventbrite to find things to do. So if you're visiting Portland, let's say, and you want to know what to do on a weekend, you would go there. Or if you're just trying to find something to do over the weekend, you would go to Eventbrite to find events. So the team I'm working on, the destination team, that's kind of the charter of what we're working on. So just a little bit backstory about myself. About 2 years ago now, I started writing this blog series about ES6 because I was learning ES6, and I found that the best way that I can learn something or verify that I've learned it is to teach somebody else. So I started learning ES6 and blogging about it. So I created this whole series that you can go to my blog and read about. And then early last year in January, I started learning React, and I did the official tutorial online. Back then it was a comment app, so it was like basically a to-do app masquerading as a comment app. And it was written in ES5, and I actually applied my ES6 learning in the tutorial so that I could rewrite it in ES6. And then late last year, I went to a React Native training course by Devin Abbott, React Native Express, and that's where I learned React Native. And I was just blown away about how close React Native was to just building React for the web. Like all the paradigms, everything I learned about building UIs in React, I could apply in React Native. It just happened to be a different environment. So, basically outside of the JSX that you're writing, React and React Native is basically a lot of JavaScript development that you're doing. You're transforming data from one form to another form, and then you're finally rendering it out. So a lot of the ES6, ES 2015, ES.Next paradigms work really well in a React Native environment, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. So if we look at this agenda here, I've got 4 kind of elements of ES.Next that I want to talk about: destructuring, arrow functions, spread operator, and classes. And what I'm going to do is kind of focus just on building React Native user interfaces. So not focusing on the features or the functionality of ES.Next that you would use while building your APIs, or that you would build helper functions, or your data layer in Redux. It's mostly what you'd be using inside of the actual components themselves. I wish I could talk about all the different features that came with ES6 and beyond, but there are about 40 or so, and I know we all want to get to lunch, so I'll just stick with these 4, and I think they'll really help us write concise and clear code. So what I did is I actually took a look at the conference app, the app that was built, and all of the examples are going to be from those. So some of the examples that I'm going to share are, I guess, what I would call code improvements that I saw that could be applied to the app. No offense, Gant. Others, I'm just going to be explaining some features that were already used in the app, so kind of showing what it would have been written in like an ES5 and then applying the ES6. I did actually consider submitting a PR that was going to be called code improvements, right? But I didn't want to be that guy, and I also didn't want to be uninvited to speak. So everything worked out. I kept it to myself. And final heads up. So what I wanted to share is that for those of you who are new to React Native or React or JavaScript in general, I'm going to be showing a lot of stuff to you. So a lot of it's going to be new. Maybe you won't grasp everything, but that's okay. Some of you who kind of know some of the core development principles, I'm hoping that I'll be able to share some new things maybe that you hadn't seen before. But for those of you who have been doing this longer than I have, I guess you could just stop paying attention to me and go on Slack or no, actually I hope there'll be like 1 or 2 nuggets that you'll be able to take away from what I'm talking about. But even if not, hopefully you can see my example of how to explain things so that you can teach other folks. All right? So let's jump right in. Here we have a screen. It's the schedule screen where you see all the talks and all the breaks going on, and it has a list of all of them. So in order to build that list here in React Native, we're using the flat list component. And I'll talk a little bit more about the render method and how that's going on with classes later. But what I really want to focus on is the render item function that's happening here to render out a component, or render out each talk or each break. So if we jump into the render item method, it takes in the info that we're trying to render that came from the data. And what I'm showing here is kind of like a pre-ES.Next or a non-ES.Next implementation. And what you see, we are pulling a lot of data out of this.state and out of info.item here to create variables so it'll be easier to render down in the JSX later on at the end of the method. So what I want to do is use destructuring here so that we can kind of optimize our code to make it a little less verbose, a little bit clearer as to what's going on. So word of warning, right? If you have never seen destructuring before, you're going to feel this way towards destructuring. Guaranteed, like no matter what, all right? But I want you to separate how you feel about destructuring with how you feel about me, okay? So you can hate destructuring, but still like me, okay? And I promise, like, after you've used destructuring a lot, you will totally feel this way about destructuring. Like, it's the best feature in ES6, in my opinion. I use it all the time. So let's jump in and let's take a look at what it is. So here we have the before, what we were doing before, and now this is what it looks like, those 2 lines up top. So what destructuring is object destructuring is we have an object literal pattern that's on the left-hand side of the assignment. So what this is saying is that we have this object, this.state. I want to take a property out of that object called current time, and I want to declare a variable of the exact same name, and then make the assignment. So it declares the variable, it takes the property out of that variable and assigns it. And similarly for isCurrentDay, it takes the property out of this.state, creates isCurrentDay variable, and then makes that assignment there. So exactly what was going down below in the before. Then if we look at the second line, it's a little bit more sophisticated. What this is saying is that inside info.item, I want to look for the type property. But I want to instead create a variable called event type here, and then make that assignment that way. And then the other ones, event start and event end, work much the same way. We're going to create variables with the same name, take properties out of info.item of that name, and then make the assignments. So it's kind of just a shorthand, what I call a drier way of doing the same thing, okay? But we can take this one step further because we're using info.item here. We can actually use nested destructuring in our application. So instead of destructuring off of info.item, we'll destructure off of info and declare item as our nesting. So we're taking that same object literal pattern that we had before, but just nesting it under item there. So we have that syntax there. So basically just not having to dereference info.item. But there's even more that we can do with object destructuring. We can actually take that object literal pattern, move it inside of the function header up here, and have something called destructured parameters. So instead of having the line right here of doing info, we move it into the function header. So now the variable info, or the parameter info, never even exists. It's immediately destructured into its relevant parameters that we want. So what we'll get out is event type, event start, and event end. And info never exists. So the nice thing about this is that it's very declarative as to what parameters in the object or what properties of the object that you care about. I know that I care about an object that has an info or an item property, and then within that object, I'm looking at event type, or type, event start, and event end. So it's, it takes a little time to understand. You know, there's a lot more curly braces than we're used to seeing up in a function header, but it ends up becoming way more declarative. So when we look at the beginning and the end, we basically went from, 5 to 6 lines of code in the function body to 1 line, and then additional code in the header. So basically, it's like ES.6 writing some code for us, basically. It's a whole lot shorter. And I sometimes use nesting, sometimes don't, depending on how verbose the nesting is or how much I'm going into it. But I think in this case, the conciseness and the clarity is well worth it. Okay, let's move on. The next feature I want to talk about deals with the location screen and the map there. So with that map, you can pan around with it, the view. So naturally, we'll use a pan responder, or create one to use inside of our component. So this is another kind of non-ES.Next implementation of what it would look like. So the pan responder has on start should set pan responder, on pan responder grant, on pan responder release, very verbose names, and those are all events that you apply or pass callback functions to, so anonymous functions. So you can see for this first one, we're just returning true in the function. But in this second one, we have an anonymous function. It takes in an event, and we want to call this.setState inside of that function. So as a result, because it's an anonymous function, we have to pass in this context that we want by calling bind. Otherwise, inside of this function, this would be undefined. And if you're not familiar with why this is undefined in this case, I have a nice little link to this very long MDN article that if you don't know what it means, you may understand. And if you already know what it means, you'll probably get confused. But that's okay. It's really explanatory. So, and then lastly down here, we have this.checkMapTap.bind this. So that's a reference to another method. Since we're passing that reference, we also have to bind to this context as well. So what's really annoying to me is particularly having to bind that this inside of an anonymous function. Right, so I wish there was something better that will kind of handle the this context for me. And that is exactly what arrow functions give us. So an arrow function, if we replace this code with arrow functions, it looks a lot cleaner, a lot less code, but then it also works functionally as well. Arrow functions are both syntax as well as functionality. So then now in the arrow function, if we just want to return true, it's this simple short syntax, and I'll explain how that works in a second. And then for this one especially, we no longer have to do a bind.this, because arrow functions have what's called lexical scoping. So basically, it's a fancy term to just say that the this context outside of where the function is declared, so in this case, inside of component did mount, the this context is the same outside of the function as it is inside of the function. As opposed to old functions, anonymous functions, the this context comes from how the function was called, not where it was defined. So now using arrow functions, we no longer have to pass bind this. I'm still passing bind here to this one, to the method, but I'll go, when I talk about classes, I'll explain why that's still happening. So an arrow function is literally like an arrow function. So it has this fat arrow, the equal sign and the greater sign, in between the parameters on the left and the function body on the right. And it can come in a lot of different forms, as you can see here. So if you have a single parameter, you can actually omit the parentheses around that parameter. But if you have no parameters, or if you have multiple parameters, then you have to have the parentheses around it. So we can see that in this first example here, we have the parentheses. But for the function body, if you have one single statement that's going to return a value, then you can omit the curly braces. And that becomes an implicit return because you can omit the return keyword as well. But if you have a single statement that's not going to return a value, or you have multiple statements, then you have to have curly braces, as we can see in these examples. And we can convert all of our stateless functions now, if you haven't already, to const arrow functions. So they can come in this style down here, and you can actually use destructuring of the props that are passed in. So you never have to have a props parameter. You can just destruct the actual props that you want directly, right in the function header. So those are arrow functions. Moving on, I've got the third example that I want to show. And we're looking at the About screen here. That's talking about Chain React and their sponsors, Squarespace. So this feature actually has nothing really to do with the About screen. It kind of applies to all screens, but this is just the screen that I decided to show. But to kind of explain this feature, I'm going to kind of take us on a journey. So stick with me here. We have here, if you're familiar with math.max, right? You can pass multiple parameters to math.max, and it'll give you back the maximum value of that. So here we're passing 33, 2, 9, and we're going to get back 33 as the max. But if you have an array of values, it's a little bit trickier to get the maximum of those. You have to use math.max.apply. And in this case, the context doesn't matter, so you can pass null, and then you pass the array as the second parameter. And the way that works is that basically apply will just take that array you had and pass each individual element as if you were calling math.max directly. So the spread operator now in ES6, that was introduced in ES6, does that for us with syntax. So now if you have an array here, 3, 2, 9, and you want to spread each one of those elements out, you can use the spread operator, which are these 3 dots. So it literally spreads out the array into each individual arguments. So it's as if you called math.max with 33, 2, 9, as opposed to with the array. So it spreads it out. So typically though, you wouldn't use a spread operator in this case. Maybe if you were calling some kind of util function that needed individual parameters and you had an array, you might do this. But the main reason I find we use the spread operator is actually to maintain immutability. So instead of pushing onto an array, you spread onto an array to copy it and then add new elements to it. And that's what's happening in this example. So we have 3 different arrays that have chunks of the musical scale, and I want to create an array that has the whole scale, all 7 parts of it. So instead of doing an empty array and pushing on it and iterating, looping over it, or maybe using concat that would create intermediary arrays, we can just simply create a new array literal and spread in start. So it will be as if this array had do and re, and then spread in middle, so it would have mi, fa, and so, and then lastly spread in end, so it had la and ti. So as if I declared that array with those 7 elements. So how exactly does this work? How is it that we can spread inside of an array and it can clone it for us? Well, the answer kind of takes us back to old school JavaScript. If you ever just did JavaScript a long time ago, instead of using array syntax for creating an array, we would actually say new array and pass in the elements here. Very verbose. And that's how you created an array. And we now have the shorthand for the bracket notation. Well, if you did the spread operator in here in the constructor, which is a function call, and now it makes sense. We have 1, then we're going to spread in 2, 3, 4, and then add in 5 at the end. And that's how we're able to create a new array from an existing array, by spreading it in. And similarly, that's how the shorthand notation works as well, because it's a map to that. So you can create new arrays by spreading. But what I'm not even really interested in spreading in arrays. That's just the ES.6 functionality, the ES 2015 functionality. What I'm most interested in is spreading into objects, because we deal mostly with objects in React, with props and with state and other things like that. So here in this example, I have the Warriors pre-Kevin Durant, and they had Steph, Clay, and Draymond with my fictitious NBA 2K ratings for each one of them. Okay, and then the team was already good enough. They had already run a championship, but they wanted to create a juggernaut, right? And they wanted to add Kevin Durant to the team. Actually, Blazers fans here are familiar with that team, right? In the playoffs this year. They ran through everybody. I feel your pain. I'm actually not a Warriors fan, even though I'm from the Bay. I'm a Houston Rockets fan because I'm originally from Houston. So you have the Warriors here, and then now they're adding Kevin Durant. And we don't want to mutate the Warriors object. There's some joke behind that. I just don't have it in my head right now. We want to create a new Warriors object and add Kevin to that new Warriors object. So we spread in the old Warriors one with Steph, Clay, and Draymond, and then we add Kevin. And that's a way to create a new object. So if you're familiar with Lodash and using the assign method, that's kind of the same thing. In fact, ES6 introduced object.assign as well, but I prefer the syntax. So the syntax, though, is not in JavaScript yet. It's in stage 3, and it's actually been sitting in stage 3 for a while now. So it's not going to be in ES 2017, hopefully in ES 2018, but it has to make it to the final stage, stage 4, in order for it to be a new JavaScript. But there are Babel plugins, transforms for it, so you could totally use it right now. So I said all of that to get us to the actual code in the app. So here's so each screen has a companion styling file that has all the definitions for the styles and creates a style sheet component or a style sheet object. So each style sheet what it does is that they spread in application styles.screen into every one of them so that every screen can have these generic styles that are predefined so that all of the screens can look the same. So in this case, application styles.screen comes from the application styles file. And if we look in there, we see that application styles.screen within it has a title text object. And that title text object spreads in some definition for fonts.style h2, and then also defines font size to be 14, and then the color to be the default color text. And title text now is used on the on-sponsors text field there with styles.titleText. And that's a kind of a way to share everything across the components. But if you even look at fonts.style.h2, here it's font weight bold and font size of size h2. So it actually is defining a font size, but then that's getting overwritten when it gets spread into this object. So order does matter in how you do the spreading. Whatever comes after will override anything that comes before. So font size is not going to be duplicated in the object. It'll just actually override it that way. So I did want to give you one bonus here. I had a feature that I wanted to talk about that was really short and I had no kind of clear place to put it. So I'm putting it right here because it's kind of related to the spread operator, but in fact this is the rest operator. So if you have an object, in this case this is this.props, and you destructure out type and style like we talked about earlier, you can actually get an object that's everything else in that object, which is the rest operator. So I'm using the rest operator here to get rest props, which will be everything else in it. So it's kind of a quick way of doing like a Lodash omit maybe to get the rest of the objects here. So I'm getting out tile and style in this fictitious example, calling calculate style to come up with some new calculated style, assigning it to the view, and then using JSX spread to spread rest props into there so I don't have to define each one of the props, because I actually don't even know all the props that would be inside of rest props. So it's actually JSX spread that I think kind of gave the idea of having object spread since it wasn't in ES6. But rest properties, this feature right here is also in stage 3. It's the same proposal as the spread properties. So hopefully it'll be coming out soon. So just to be clear, in case you were confused, the rest operator is 3 dots, and what it does is it takes an object and it spreads it into multiple objects. So it takes this warriors object and spreads it into multiple objects so that you can create a new object literal. And you use it on the right-hand side of an assignment. Whereas the rest operator takes multiple properties and coalesces them together into one object, and you use it on the left-hand side of the assignment so that you can get all those together. So they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. They look the exact same, right? 3 dots, but they do slightly different things. Okay, last one that I want to talk about, and we're focusing on this little taking Uber or Lyft toggle right there in the location screen. So the location screen is a component, and we use classes to do our components. And this is what it looks like, basically. So I want to kind of break down what this is all doing in terms of ES.Next. So we have our static properties there, our static prop types rather, state, this private method function type thing I want you to pay attention to especially, and then our render method. So we're talking about classes here. So if this is what ES 2015, the class structure defines. So you can have some static methods, you can have a constructor, you can have instance methods, and that's it. No properties whatsoever, static properties or instance properties. So if we were to convert what we saw here into ES6 or ES 2015, just vanilla ES 2015, it will look like this. So now the prop types are defined and assigned down below here as the static property. The instance property state is assigned in the constructor there because there's no definitions for those. And then toggle rides right here is a method. And because it's a method and we're passing it to onPress, we have to do a bind.this. Because if we're passing this method as a reference and it's going to be called, we need to make sure that it has the proper this context. So we have to bind this to it. And I'm calling this private because I'm using the underscore kind of convention for a private. It doesn't actually make it private, but using that convention there as a naming convention. But if we add the public class fields proposal, which is sitting in stage 2, and it has been in stage 2 for a while as well, unfortunately, we can now declare the static properties. So this is how you're able to do static prop types and state as declarations because of this proposal, the public class fields. So this is nice because now instead of doing assignments of the static properties and assignments of the instance properties, you can now declare them right in the class so that you can kind of see, oh, these are the static properties, these are the instance properties. But you still have to do the bind here for that toggle rides method. But having that bind there is potentially bad because every time the state changes, every time we have to do a render, we're creating a new one-off function that's not being reused. So if you're rendering a lot, you're going to be creating a lot of functions. So we don't like that. People don't like that. So what folks have done is instead of having toggle rides be a true method on the class, they've made it a bound arrow function property. So it's now, it's a property, instance property, just like state. It just happens to be a function that you can call. So because it's now an arrow function, and we learned that arrow functions have lexical scoping, you no longer have to bind this here because it'll have the proper this scope. And because it's arrow functions, you can have like implicit returns there, so it actually can look like some nice syntax. But I'm not 100% sold on this as a solution just yet because it looks like a method, but like I said, it's an instance property function. So if we go back to how it would be in ES6 world, what this actually is just a arrow function that's assigned to the property like that. So that's what it actually is. It looks like a method, but it's not. So what that means is that this function, toggle rides, cannot be extended or it cannot be subclassed. If you wanted to actually subclass location screen, toggle rides would not be there. So we don't do OOP and React Native anyway in terms of our components, so it's not a huge deal. You probably wouldn't subclass the location screen for any reason. You would probably use HOCs or something like that to share code. But so it's probably not a problem. But the one nice thing about this approach, about using this kind of bound instance property or arrow function, is that we'll be able to leverage a new feature that's coming as well, and that's private class fields. So before I was using underscore to signify that it was private, but now there's a proposal to put a hashtag or a pound sign in front of it to actually make it private, like truly private. Nothing else can access it outside of the class. And by making it, and it only applies to properties, static or instance. So now when I put that hashtag there, I no longer have to do this dot toggle rides. I can just put the hashtag there. Wherever there's a private function or private property signified by the hashtag, you can omit the this dot and just put the hashtag there. So you can save 4 characters or so by using that. And I think that's pretty cool. Not the saving of the characters, but just that functionality of having privates, finally, true privates in JavaScript. Yeah, exactly. So the thing is, though, is that there's not even a Babel transform for this yet. So you can't actually go off and use this Somebody in this room has to implement a Babel transform so we can actually all benefit from it. But it's actually pretty complicated. If you look at the spec, and it has to create like a unique name for this thing internally, like it's not something that's going to be easily implemented or implementable. So that's all that we talked about. Again, we talked about destructuring so we could have concise and clear code, and arrow functions so we could have lexical scoping plus concise code. The spread operator so we can maintain immutability and not copy things around. And then obviously classes so that our code is very declarative. So I have a whole bunch of additional resources for you here. We already saw earlier the official React Native documentation, the tutorial there. And if you're interested, you can go to my blog series about ES.Next. And I highly suggest also, if you're getting into React Native, to look at the conference app. It's pretty straightforward to follow along what's going on, and it's a pretty good example of what you can see to build kind of a real app, but that's not just crazy big as well. And then Eventbrite, we have a whole bunch of coding standards around ES6, ES.Next, and React that you can check out. So to close, I'd like to give a couple of shout outs to some folks. I'd like to shout out obviously the conference, Chain React, for inviting me to be here. As I mentioned earlier, a year ago I didn't even know React Native, and now I'm here speaking at the first ever React Native conference. Like, that's amazing. For me to be here. So I feel really blessed and privileged to be here. So thanks to Jaymon and Shawnee and the rest of the Infinite Red crew for inviting me to be here. Also, I want to thank Eventbrite, my company, for sending me out here and allowing me to be here and to share with you. We're not on the React Native train quite yet, but obviously I'm trying to push us towards that and trying to convince our mobile developers that it may not be that bad of an idea. As well. So if anybody has any hints on how to, convince, please let me know. And then lastly, I want to thank all of you here for listening. I know lunch is next, and I'm standing between you and lunch, but most of you stayed here, which is great. And the whole reason why I do this is that I want to be able to kind of impart my knowledge so that coming away from this talk, maybe you learned one little thing that you can use and apply in your everyday life, not just some pie-in-the-sky things, but something that tomorrow you could go and refactor some code or clean up some code so that your code can be a little better, or you know a little bit now to be able to teach somebody else a little bit. So I thank you very much, and if you have any feedback about how it all went, please let me know. If it's not good feedback, please be gentle, but if it's great feedback, throw it at me, all right? Thank you very much.